Hello and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Hope everyone is doing well. Today I have 4 ghost stories from the Haunted Canada series. If I pronounce anything wrong, I do apologize. The Haunted Castle in the Woods, Ignacy, Ontario. The wilderness of northern Ontario is a magical place full of mystery and beauty. The locals are fond of saying there's more water than land. Most of the best camping sites near Ignacy are only accessible by boat or plane in the summer and snowmobiles in the winter. It's a popular area for outdoorsy people in search of unspoiled nature. At night, the stars shine brilliantly in the sky, and the only sounds are the wind, the wildlife, and, along the shores of White Otter Lake, the unsettling wanderings of a hermit ghost. In the early 1990s, a man and his family canoed into White Otter Lake, unaware of what lay before them. Part of Turtle River Provincial Park, the lake is undeveloped and pristine. There are no lived-in homes or cottages. Like many who have explored the lake before them, the family was shocked when they turned a bend and saw on the opposite shoreline a huge rustic mansion standing out among the trees. What was it doing there? Did anyone live in such a remote location, and if so, who? The allure of the building pulled them toward it as firmly as a giant pair of claws. The 3-story log cabin was built entirely from huge red pine logs that appeared to weigh a ton. It had a 4-story lookout tower set with windows in each of 4 walls. The roof, although faded, was red. The house didn't appear to be occupied, and its interior was completely empty. The walls were covered with graffiti. The family had unwittingly stumbled upon White Otter Castle. Outside, a short distance from the front door, was a wooden grave marker. It had a cross-shaped hole carved straight through its center. Surrounding the grave were 4 short wooden fence boards. The weed-choked ground at the foot of the grave marker was covered by a pile of rocks. One rock was larger than the others and had a name written on it, Jimmy McOut. Although it was a little creepy, the man and his wife decided to pitch their tent and spend the night before moving on in the morning. They sat around a fire, the soothing crackle of the burning wood providing a soft soundtrack to their conversation. The silver moon filled the sky and glistened on the lake surface. Something rustled in the woods, an animal most likely, and a big one by the sound of it. The kids decided to call it a night and slipped into their tent. Their mother wasn't long after them. The father remained by the fire alone for a short spell before joining his family. He doused the fire with a good amount of water and then covered the entire fire pit in sand. Once the fire was completely out and not even a single wisp of smoke remained, he joined his family and fell asleep. A few hours later, he was awoken by an odd sound, a crackling fire. Flickering orange light filtered through the canvas siding of the tent. Wondering how the fire could have possibly started again on its own, the man unzipped the door flap and poked his head out. He stayed in the tent when he saw that the fire hadn't set itself again. It had been started by a stranger, a ghost. The specter sat in the same spot the father had earlier, facing the fire with his back to the tent. He was in his 60s, had a small build, wore a floppy hat, and poked the fire with a long stick. The ghost looked over his shoulder, and for a moment the 2 men, one living, one dead, locked eyes. The ghost silently beckoned for the man to leave the tent and join him, but the father shook his head and hastily zipped the door again. Little good that would do to protect his family from a ghost. He managed to drift back to sleep. When he awoke early in the morning, he stepped outside. The ghost was gone. So the man investigated the fire pit as the sun rose orange and gold. He had to shake his head again. The pit was exactly as he had left it, covered with sand before turning in the previous night. There was no sign of freshly charred wood. It was as if the reignited fire had been, like the stranger who tended it, a ghost. All these years later, he still gets chills when he tells the story of the spirit who joined his sleeping family on their camping trip. The ghost the man saw was Jimmy McCout, the eccentric hermit who is buried beside White Otter Castle. Amazingly, Jimmy built the mansion in 1915 by himself at the age of 59. Jimmy was the son of Scottish immigrants and the youngest of 6 sons. His family moved to Canada in the mid-1800s and settled in the Ottawa Valley. But Jimmy set out on his own when he was 31. He settled in Emo, Ontario, and built a homestead on a half section of prime land, which grew to include 2 farms owned by the hard-working young man. Despite efforts to find a bride, Jimmy never married and spent the rest of his life alone. When the gold rush took the country by storm in 1899, Jimmy sold his farms, his home, and his land and set out once again. This time to stake his claim. A year later, he had lost everything. Without a penny to his name, but refusing to give up, Jimmy ventured even deeper into the wild and found the remote White Otter Lake. More than 30 kilometers away from the nearest town in 1903, he picked a secluded location on the North Shore and, despite not owning the land, built a small, modest shack. He survived by eating the meat of wild animals he trapped and vegetables he grew in a small garden. Time passed slowly, and Jimmy was content to live the life of a forest hermit. But as he grew older, he was troubled by a childhood memory. When he was a young boy, he had a good friend who was a bit of a prankster. One day this friend threw an ear of corn and hit a cranky, ill-tempered neighbor of theirs. The man spun on his heel and accused Jimmy of throwing the corn. With flushed cheeks and fire in his eyes, the man cursed young Jimmy. "Jimmy McCout," he spat, "you'll never do any good. You'll die in a shack." Years later, on the shores of White Otter Lake, this scene played over and over in Jimmy's mind like an old movie that never stopped. He sat alone in his shack and wondered if that grumpy old man's curse would come true. It certainly seemed as it would, unless Jimmy did something. And so, despite his age and slight build, Jimmy set out building himself a castle in the woods. Being a Canadian castle, it was fittingly made of logs. He felled the trees, dragged them across his property with a homemade winch, and somehow lifted each one into place. The tower walls, for example, are 43 logs tall, and each log weighs well over 350 kilograms. He did all this without the aid of machinery, horses, or other workers. He added one final morbid addition to the property: his own grave. He was afraid that after his death he'd be buried in a cemetery far from his castle, and the curse would follow him into the afterlife. By the time he had finished White Otter Castle, Jimmy had one last laugh. "Ye couldn't call it a shack, could ye?" he said with pride. "No, ye couldn't call it a shack, and I built it all myself." But it's best not to tempt fate, for fate can be cruel. In 1918, shortly after he finished building his castle in the woods, Jimmy mysteriously disappeared. His body was discovered in the lake a year later by a fire ranger. Evidence suggested he had become entangled in his own fishing nets and drowned. Grotesquely, his head and arms had become detached from his body and were never recovered. But what remained of Jimmy was buried in the grave of his own making, as per his wishes. Perhaps he couldn't bring himself to leave his beloved log mansion after he died, or perhaps he didn't manage to break the curse and is condemned to remain there forever. Whatever the case, the ghost of Jimmy McCout has been spotted by many campers and outdoors enthusiasts, spending a night in or near his home. The provincial government has erected a plaque telling his story, and volunteers work tirelessly to keep White Otter Castle in good condition. They put one of the only photos of Jimmy wearing his floppy hat on an interior wall in the hopes it will give his spirit a little rest. But it doesn't seem to be working. In life, Jimmy McCout wished to live on his own. It's not hard to believe that, in death, he might still prefer to roam the earth in solitude. Some things that hide deep in the woods are better left alone. The Blue Nun, Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Before the residence closed in 2013, first-year students moving into Mount St. Bernard College at St. Francis Xavier University were issued a dire warning. Make sure your chair is tucked tightly under your desk before you go to sleep. Upper year students told new arrivals in all seriousness, or else the Blue Nun will take a seat and watch you through the night. The unexplained phenomena were so prevalent and widespread that midnight visits from the Blue Nun became a rite of passage for St. Francis Xavier students living on campus. After studying late at night, students would wake to see their chair, which they were certain they had left in its usual place at their desk, dragged across the room to face their bed. Others claimed they had been awoken by the faint blue glow of the ghost nun and saw her sitting watching. As scary as that sounds, one particular student was targeted by the ghost over a much longer period than culminated in an absolutely petrifying event. One day after class, the young man returned to his dorm room. He unlocked the door, took a step inside, and was instantly confronted by an unsettling sight. All of his books and other belongings, clothes, food, toiletries, had been strewn across the room. The likely assumption was that a fellow schoolmate was engaging in a juvenile prank. But no one else had a key to the room. Nobody owned up to the incident. Then a few days later, it happened again. And again a few days after that. As doubt and fear consumed him, the only solace the student could find in the troubling disturbance was that it only happened when he wasn't in the room. That would soon change. After putting everything he owned back in its place for the umpteenth time, the boy fell into a deep slumber. His sleep didn't last long, interrupted by a loud crash as a pile of textbooks, far too heavy to be moved by a draft, toppled off his desk to the floor. Like the phenomenon that was occurring while he was away from his room, this midnight mess became a regular happening in the weeks ahead. With the lack of sleep came a troubling question: who was responsible for this targeted attack? The boy soon had his answer, although in no way, shape, or form was it a comforting one. He was awoken in the middle of the night one final time, but not in the crash of falling books. Instead, however, directly above his bed was a dark, shadowy being. It stared down at him intently with red, glowing eyes. He opened his mouth but found he was unable to scream. The red-eyed shadow pointed down at him menacingly with a long, bony finger and then dissipated into the air like a cloud of smoke never to be seen again. There's a story widely circulated around STFX campus to shed some light on the Blue Nun's existence. Mount St. Bernard College was originally a college for Catholic women and became North America's first to initiate post-secondary degree programs for women in 1897. Classes were taught by the nuns of the Congregation de Notre Dame, but a gradual shift occurred and classes were taught by the university. The Mount, as it's commonly known, became a co-ed residence for first and second year STFX students. While the Mount was in the hands of the Congregation de Notre Dame, it's believed that a nun fell in love with a priest. She became riddled with guilt and fell into a deep depression from which she would never resurface. She walked up to the Mount's fourth floor, stepped onto a balcony, and without a moment of hesitation, flung herself over the railing. She died shortly after her body hit the ground below. The priest, distraught with his own guilt following the nun's suicide, hanged himself in one of the Mount stairwells. Some people believe in a much darker version of the story, claiming that the priest invited the nun to the fourth floor balcony and pushed her over the edge before taking his own life. Although the priest is also believed to haunt the Mount, watching people walk up and down the stairwell where he committed suicide. One former student even claims to accidentally caught the priest in a photograph. It's the Blue Nun's specter that is most often seen and feared. In fact, her actions and behavior classify her as a poltergeist, a mischievous ghost known for creating loud noises and throwing physical objects in order to terrorize the living. She makes the lights in dorm rooms flicker on and off without moving the switch, turns on the bathroom faucets to full, and continues to throw students' belongings around their rooms. She wakes people by slamming doors and turning computers on, even one that wasn't plugged into the wall outlet. Although most post-secondary students often sacrifice sleep for all-night study sessions, students at STFX are far more tired than most before they've cracked open a single book. Queen of the Dead, St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. During the first half of the 19th century, St. John's was a rough and tumble outpost and the site of countless bloody deaths. Unwanted and unclaimed bodies piled up quickly. People who had no one to see them to the grave. Passengers who had died aboard ships, making the long and arduous transatlantic journey from Europe to North America. Executed felons who had dropped from the gallows, and inmates of the insane asylum who had breathed their last breath. There were no morgues in the city in the 1840s, so town officials paid a standing salary to one woman, Nancy Coyle, to prepare the not-so-dearly departed for burial. She washed, dressed, and prepared bodies for their final rest, right in her own home where she ate and slept. By all accounts, Nancy was exceptionally skilled at her job, so skilled in fact that she had the power to bring people back from the dead. One day Nancy was nailing a coffin shut when the deceased Dutch sailor, who was about to be buried 6 feet under, suddenly revived with a start. Nancy did the only thing she could think to do. She gave him a drink of rum, followed by another, and the man was himself again. He thanked her for her services, informed her he'd no longer require the casket, and promptly left her home. Another time, late in the evening, after a hard day's work, Nancy covered a fresh corpse in her parlor under a white sheet. The dead man was John Murphy, a man who'd spent many years in an insane asylum and was due to be buried the following morning. Nancy left the parlor and went to bed. She couldn't sleep. There was an odd noise coming from the parlor. She was convinced she was mistaken. Nancy lived alone, and there was no one else in the house, just her and the bodies. But the noise didn't go away. It was low and disturbing. It slowly grew louder. It sounded like a moan, perhaps that of an animal. Surely that's all it was, an animal, possibly wounded, that had somehow gotten into her house. She wearily got out of bed, lit a candle, hugged her nightdress around her torso, and tiptoed through the creaky old home to the parlor. The moaning turned to groaning and was even louder now. She gripped the door handle with shaky fingers and hesitated a moment before finding the fortitude to open it. It swung open with a shrill creak. With a glance around the room, Nancy quickly realized there was no animal inside, just John, his body beneath the sheet where she had left it. Ugh, there was the groan again. Had it come from under the table that held John's covered body? No, there was nothing underneath. She crossed the room. Shadows danced on the walls around her, animated by the flickering candlelight she held before her. She placed the candle down and pinched the white sheet between her forefinger and thumb. Then, summoning all her courage, Nancy pulled the sheet away from his face. The corpse's eyes flew open. They stared up at Nancy, deep into her own wide eyes. She gasped and jumped back. John slipped off the table and fled from her house. 4 days afterward, the reanimated body was seen shambling through the streets and dark alleyways in St. John's, muttering to himself and yelling at passerby. The townsfolk were already leery of Nancy Coyle, the lady who spent her days working with bodies and her nights sleeping under the same roof of the dead. But when word began to spread that she had supernatural powers that could bring the dead back to life, she was practically ostracized. She continued her life's work, but when she died in her parlor years later, friendless and alone, there was no one willing to do for her that she did for other outcasts who had died in the city. There is no marked grave for Nancy Coyle. No one knows what happened to her body. People know all too well, on the other hand, what happened to her soul. Newfoundlanders have seen Nancy's ghost wearing a long red cloak, wandering through the city cemeteries alone in the dark. She keeps her head down and answers to no one, a loner in the night. When approached, she disappears. Others have seen her leading a ghostly horse-drawn hearse along streets near cemeteries, startling people who had gone to pay their respects. One such unfortunate person was Bradley Smith, who was standing silently before his aunt's headstone as the moon rose in the sky. It was a sort of night that shadows seemed to skitter along the ground, and every foot and rock poking through the dirt looks like skeletal hands, clawing their way out of the earth. Bradley was about to leave when he saw Nancy walking toward him. She was wearing her old-fashioned red cloak. Her eyes, framed by the hood, was sad and pale. Unaware that she was dead as the bodies that were buried all around him, Bradley asked Nancy if she was okay. She didn't answer. Thinking she hadn't heard him, he called again and approached. As she passed by, she suddenly vanished in the moonlight. Bradley said it was the strangest thing he had ever seen and left him feeling terribly frightened. Years after the incident, he still isn't able to go back to that cemetery alone, not even during the day. It's sad to think Nancy Coyle, the Queen of the Dead, spent her life preparing bodies for burial, and no one was willing to do for her in return. And if she truly could bring back the dead, it's unfortunate she wasn't able to do so for herself. Then again, since she haunts cemeteries and watches over row upon row of decomposing bodies, you could say she has cheated death. Despite this, she doesn't seem to be able to rest in peace. The Nahaka, Trout Lake, Northwest Territories. In a small northern community only reachable by bush, plain, very few people can hear you scream. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, however, the 51 residents of Trout Lake, located in the Northwest Territories near the British Columbia border, did a lot of screaming. There was a being lurking in the woods, a phantom that tormented the locals over a 5-year period. They called him the Nahaka, or Bushman. He was a tall, intimidating figure who stirred up a great deal of panic and fear by hiding in the cover of the surrounding woods, spying on residents. A small ghost dog was sometimes seen by his side. He also had one of the oddest habits imaginable for a ghost. He liked to play dead. A young girl and her brother were outside chopping wood one day, pitching in to help their family. As they walked along a wooded path with armfuls of freshly hewn logs, they encountered the Naka. He was laying face down in the dirt like a dead man. They soon discovered he was a dead man, but not in the way they had initially thought. As quick as a flash, the Naka flew to his feet and floated toward the startled children with his arms outstretched and anger in his eyes. A dog materialized at his feet, yipping howlily. The siblings dropped the wood and ran away as fast as they could. Luckily, they escaped before he could touch them. Today, Trout Lake is still a small, isolated community, fewer than 100 people. Called the village home, the majority of whom belong to the Deisho First Nations. Mail is delivered weekly by plane, and residents can order books and movies through the Northwest Territories Public Library Services Borrow by Mail program. People can reach Trout Lake in the winter by road, but the only way in or out the rest of the year is by plane. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were called in to investigate the strange case of the Naka after they received complaints from a local fisherman and families reporting that the spectral bushman had stolen fish from their nets and caribou and moose meat from their drying racks. Unsurprisingly, the authorities found no trace of the apparition and soon left, but the Naka continued to haunt the area. He usually appeared at dusk as the sun was setting behind the trees across the lake. While enjoying dinner, families would glimpse a man's face peering in through the windows in their cabins. Moments before disappearing, parents and children would rush outside to discover the Naka had vanished, leaving behind a trail of ghostly footprints that led into the woods. The residents concluded the apparition must dwell in the surroundings open spruce forest, gliding above the moss and berry carpeted floor with his dog. Some argued that the Naka might be a living man, but that theory was quickly rejected. No man could survive on his own without a dwelling, with winter lows of -50 and ice that lasts on the lake well into June. Trout Lake is nearly 1,000 kilometers northwest of Edmonton, separated from Yellowknife by Great Slave Lake and virtually impossible to reach from the nearest community on foot. So the Naka couldn't be traveling to and from the community. The only explanation was that the bushman was actually a bush ghost. Still, there were skeptics, including Chief Joseph Jumbo, who thought the Naka didn't exist at all. But then one day he had his own encounter with the Naka that completely changed his opinion of the mysterious man in the woods. He had seen much of his 77 years, and after confronting the Naka himself, spared little time for anyone who believed the shadowy intruder was a product of anyone's imagination. While setting his fishnets on the mouth of one of Trout Lake's creeks, Jumbo caught a glimpse of a man following him in the bushes along the bank. It was the Naka, taunting the chief by whistling at him. Not one to be easily intimidated or frightened. Jumbo stood and faced the Naka directly. "I'm chief here," he proclaimed. "If you come out into the open, we'll be happy to give you anything you might need, food, clothing, or moccasins." Despite the kindness of the chief's offer, the Naka refused to answer or show himself, as if he had disappeared once again. Jumbo would later admit to a reporter that he began to get very scared at that moment. He would have been happy to aid the Naka or leave him alone, so long as he knew what he wanted and who or what he was. But the shadowy man's silence worried Jumbo. He feared the Naka might do something to Trout Lake's children, maybe even steal one away into the woods. He had, after all, come after the young siblings chopping wood. Fortunately, as time passed, the Naka was rarely seen again. After 5 years, he disappeared altogether. What didn't disappear so quickly was the fear the ghostly bushman had installed in the residents of Trout Lake, that, like ice on a northern lake, took a lot longer to fully melt away. Thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking to my channel, and I will see you on the next one.